Hello and welcome to our 7-8 minutes of weekly Torah talk. Our guest today is Rabbi Leah Cohen, Executive Director and Senior Jewish Chaplain of the Slivka Center at Yale University. Hello, Rabbi. Thank you for being with us.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Our parsha is Vayera. What an eventful parsha. 3 days after circumcision, Abraham rushes off to prepare a meal for 3 guests who appear in the desert. One of them announces that in 1 year, the barren Sarah will give birth to a son. Sarah laughs. Abraham pleads with God to spare the wicked city of Sodom, but the city is ultimately destroyed. His nephew Lot is saved. Lot's 2 daughters, believing that they and their father are the only ones left alive in the world, get their father drunk, lie with him, and become pregnant. The 2 sons born to them father the nations of Moab and Ammon. Abraham moves to Gerar, where the Philistine king Abimelech takes Sarah in his place, to his palace. And in a dream, God warns Abimelech that he will die unless he returns the woman to her husband. A son is born to Abraham and Sarah. He is named Yitzchak. Yitzchak meaning will laugh. Hagar and Ishmael are banished from Abraham's home and wander in the desert. God saves Ishmael's life by showing his mother a well. And the most famous story in this parsha, God tests Abraham's devotion by commanding him to sacrifice Yitzchak. Yitzchak is bound and placed on the altar, but then a voice from heaven calls to stop Abraham, and a ram is offered in Yitzchak's place. The first pasuk of the parsha says, Vayera elav Adonai beElohem Mamre v'hu yoshev petach ha'oel kechom hayom. Now the Lord appeared to him in the plains of Mamre, and he was sitting at the entrance of the tent when the day was hot. So after this long introduction, we have so many topics on which to speak when we think about this parsha. But let's begin at the beginning. Abraham is sitting in his tent. It is the desert and it is hot. Why do we need all these details?
Well, there's a lot of details in this Torah portion, but the ones that lead us in, draw us into the portion, I think really have a lot to say about hospitality, especially if you imagine the desert culture and what that must have been like. And what we quickly see is that the story draws us in its own radical hospitality. This idea that Abraham didn't take it passively. He rushed to welcome these guests. He cooked for them. He gave them the choice of everything, the best of, and not just him, his wife as well. Sarah was there by his side, also hustling to make these people, these strangers, feel so welcome.
And all this when Abraham is still in pain from having had a circumcision 3 days earlier.
Exactly. We see this in this kind of radical hospitality, ultimate concern for the other and almost no concern for his own well-being. He actually humbles himself. He bows to the ground and says, please, I'm begging you to stay and to come inside. And it's just the most gracious form of hospitality. And it really serves as a symbol and as an emblem to us who try to emulate this level of graciousness.
And when you use the term radical hospitality, do you mean radical in a negative sense or in a positive sense? You know, radicalism is not always positive.
Well, this is, thank goodness, we do have some examples of radical goodness. I would say, radical listening or radical hospitality. Why do I use the word radical? Is because it's exceptional, it's extreme, except in this case, extreme in the good. And our commentators really go out of their way to point out how he does what he does, how he welcomes his guests. And I think for me, as not a native Hebrew speaker, when I think of the actual language for how we welcome, if you think about it, we say Bruchim Habayim. Already we're bringing blessing into welcoming, or Kabbalat Panim, to welcome by receiving the face. It's such an intimate way of talking about treating people in the sense of hospitality. I think for me, the verse that stands out, that's not from this parsha, but comes a little bit later on, is that we see, for example, when Jacob and Esau reconnect, and they haven't seen each other in a while, and Jacob is afraid as to what's going to happen here.
Right.
And because Esau receives him so nicely, he turns around and says, "For to see your face is like seeing the face of God." I mean, that is really radical welcoming. And again, I just think it's a beautiful piece of our history and our heritage.
Right. I think about the role of Abraham in our history. And we tend to think about him as the first person to spread the notion of one God, the notion of monotheism. Maybe radical hospitality is what he needs, because his role is to take people in and convince them of something.
Yeah. It's interesting. As a change agent, sometimes we think that change has to come with force or, some kind of power or strength, but there is change that's possible through kindness and hospitality and generosity. Of course, we think of that fable about the wind and the sun trying to get the man to take his coat off, right? And the wind blows harder and harder. He holds his coat closer and closer, and the sun just shines gently, and he takes off his coat like that.
And also thinking about the three fathers, then Jacob keeps wandering. He's the constant traveler, and you have Yitzchak, Avram's sons, who doesn't leave the tent, and then you have Abraham, who brings the world into the tent. So these are three different concepts of how one lives one's life.
Yeah. It's sort of, we have the term connector people. He's the ultimate connector from bringing outside into the inside. And even this notion of who's a stranger, he treats these so-called strangers as if they're family. He couldn't possibly have been any kinder or more generous in responding to them. So he would be an example of somebody who, if he had a Facebook page or a LinkedIn, he'd have like thousands of friends, right? Because he's just such a person who's warm and connecting like that.
And tell me, I always wonder when we encounter these great characters from the Torah, when we see radical hospitality, are we expected to also be radical in our ways of or is it, do they show us Abraham only to tell us, well, you can't get as far, but try to be as best as you can?
Well, that's a great question, especially because in the same parsha, we have another example of hospitality, but this time with a slightly different message, right? Because in the same parsha, we have Lot and what happened to him. So that story, again, is about hospitality, but I would say it teaches us the limits of hospitality, and especially the relationship of hospitality and conditions, right? Because Lot was living in Sodom, where really it was forbidden to be hospitable, and people were punished for being nice and kind and welcoming. So on the one hand, you could say, wow, how incredible that he did take in these strangers, these visitors. But as we know, there's limits to hospitality. Most of the people who read Lot's behavior at the point that he was willing to turn over his daughters, we say, yesh gvul, there's a limit to what's hospitable.
So
we
maybe
see that even we have two lessons right in the same parsha on hospitality.
So and maybe the second lesson, the lesson of Lot, is that part of being part of doing this the right way is to choose an environment in which being hospitable is something that you can do without crossing a certain limit.
Yeah. And yet, when we're in difficult environments, some might say, "Oh my God!" In some ways, Lot was more heroic than Avraham because he did bring these strangers into his home, whereas when Avraham brought them into his home, he knew he wasn't going to die. At worst, he'd have to give up a little food, a little bit of time, a little bit of energy. But Lot really put his life on the line in hospitality. So it's possible to judge him negatively. One could also say, wow, he's kind of heroic.
Right. One question that I have to ask. How do you reconcile Abraham's gracious treatment of his guests and then his decision to let Hagar go?
Yeah.
That's a tough one, I know.
That's the opposite. It's the opposite of hospitality, right? Yeah. But one of the things that, for me, in reading the Torah, that's quite wonderful, is that nobody is held up as a saint. Nobody, even Avraham, does things that we look at and say, how could he do that? How could he take something and offer him in that way? How could he cast this concubine, this woman who he has loved, who he had a child with, out in the desert? And I think that these examples, for me, make it much more realistic because they're not saints and they're not, they're people. They're people and they make mistakes and they're also subject to all the human foibles, right? So he's subject to his wife. Which husband is not subject to his wife's nagging after a while, right? And so I think that makes him very human.
Well, I of course, I recommend reading every parsha in the Torah, but this week's parsha is definitely one that everybody has to read. It's really one of the great.
I agree, and there's so much in it, and it's interesting that it begins with welcoming. It's as if we're welcomed into the parsha with the concept of welcoming, and I think it has lessons for our own personal lives and beyond.
Rabbi, thank you so much, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.